Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event, which is our second installment of the Restarting the Future series, hosted by Where the Leaves Fall and Icarus Complex magazine. My name is Emma Bryce. I'm an independent journalist and contributor to Icarus Complex. And today I will be joined by editors, writers, innovators, and artists from 3 publications. We're coming together to delve into the theme of regeneration and how this concept is driving tangible shifts in our approaches to our planet, its people, and its resources. Icarus Complex and Where the Leaves Fall are really delighted this evening to be joined by It's Freezing in LA. Each of these 3 independent magazines is dedicated to telling stories about climate change and the environment. Today, each of our 3 segments will be devoted to 1 publication each, which will invite us during that segment, to explore a different facet on this evening's theme. To start, Icarus Complex will dive into the world of design, and it will explore how the growing spotlight on regeneration has pushed designers to reconsider not only what they create and how, but also who design actually serves. Next, we have Where the Leaves Fall, who will take us through a conversation between a writer and an artist who will discuss the regenerative power of food, not just in terms of nutrition, but also as a force for creating and for problem solving. Just to add a really quick note here that one of our speakers for this segment is dealing with electricity load shedding in South Africa, which may disrupt her connection somewhat, but we are crossing fingers, and please do be patient with us if there are any technical glitches. Finally, we will have It's Freezing in LA, who will explore regeneration through the lens of public urban space and how the act of transforming these shared environments can double as a way to serve ecological goals and boost social justice too. Each presentation will be about 15 minutes long, and we're going to leave some time for questions at the end, about 10 or 15 minutes. And on that note, just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive right in. If you are interested in viewing the previous event, you can find it on YouTube. Just search for it there with the hashtag RestartingTheFuture. If you have a question during the panel discussions that you'd like to put to one of our speakers, please do feel free to add it to the Q&A box, and we'll choose from those at the end. Please also feel free to upvote any questions you'd especially like to see answered. Just click the thumbs up icon that appears underneath each one. And then just a final note to say that this event is being recorded, and we will release the video in the next few days as a link for people to be able to see afterwards. You won't be visible at any point, but of course, if we ask your question, we may end up using your name, which is just something to be aware of. With that all said and done, I'm really pleased now to be handing over to Afsaneh Rafi, who is the editor of Icarus Complex magazine, and she will be introducing our first speaker.
Hi, thank you, Emma, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As Emma mentioned, I'm the editor of Icarus Complex, a publication that takes an in-depth look at the issues and solutions around climate change, combining journalism with ambitious photography and illustration. I'm happy to announce that our 3rd issue is finally out. It was a long birth, but you can order a copy on our website if you want. It's really exciting for me to present John Case here tonight, who's written for Icarus before and who will look at the notion of regeneration through design. John is an American writer and visual designer who's based in Sweden. He's the art director of The Drift magazine and has written on design and the ecological crisis for a number of publications. It's also an important topic for me personally because the idea of Icarus really germinated back in 2018 when I was writing a book on design and had a great deal of conversations with designers on the notion of sustainability and the end cycle of products and design. So without further ado, I hand over to you, John.
Oh, thank you, Afsaneh. And thank you for everyone for taking the time to be here today. As Afsaneh said, I'm going to be discussing regenerative design and how it is influencing the creative process, and more importantly, how it is changing the role of the designer in this time of ecological crisis and climate catastrophe. So ecological crisis has been a key problem for designers for the last 50 years. In 1971, Victor Papanek wrote the influential manifesto Design for the Real World, which read today is just as prescient, if not more so than it was in its time. In it, Papanek decries many of the same things that climate-anxious designers are openly criticizing today. The supremacy of fossil fuel vehicles and materials and infrastructures, what he called Kleenex culture of single-use products and objects, planned obsolescence in technology, and generally material excess. Papanek also proposed alternatives that are not so different than what many designers are talking about today, looking for products and designs that use solar and wind energy, electric-powered cars, biodegradable materials, and looking at nature for inspiration through biomimicry. Papanek saw design in his time as a tool of capital and for spreading a dangerous culture of materialism, but also saw that design could be a powerful conduit for both social and ecological change. Regrettably, the socio-ecological design education that Papanek called for at the time remains pretty scarce in many design university programs. But nonetheless, designers around the world have persisted in pushing for more ecological design practice. As the climate crisis continues to catalyze, the concerns over how design is shaping our material environment have heightened dramatically, obviously. The result is that designers have become increasingly inventive in developing new sustainable methodologies and products. Obviously, many of the same problems having to do with how material is sourced and how the system of production and consumption relies upon immense waste have only gotten worse since the 1970s. The influence of design for the real world, along with other influential manifestos on sustainable productions like Cradle to Cradle in the early 2000s, have made material-based approaches to sustainability and design one of the primary modes of addressing environmental catastrophe for designers, resulting in the emergence of a whole new biomaterial aesthetic in products and fashion design. Yet that hasn't stopped multinational producers from continuing to pump out beautifully designed waste into ecosystems across the earth. And just as urgently as designers are finding more promising sustainable approaches, large brands are quickly picking up on material innovations, primarily driven by the new marketing equity to be gained through the aesthetic of climate-conscious products. The biodegradable mycelial grown product that occurs at a small, localized level for a specific ecosystem within a limited market system has obvious ecological value, yet once scaled up to a massive supply chains of multinational brands, the potential for ecological regeneration becomes utterly mystified, as the full scale of its impact is unknowable, ever-changing, and impossible to map due to its sheer immensity of output and production. Following this trajectory, many promising biomaterial alternatives developed by designers lose their capacity for ecological regeneration as industrial systems alienate them from their originally intended contexts. The growing urgency of these environmental calamities have pushed designers to look to more radical approaches for social ecological design, and many see regenerative design as a necessary addition or alternative to sustainability, especially as more corporations boast their commitments to the contradictory promises of sustainable growth. Regenerative design, as it is applied to the Western design tradition, is most directly derived from landscape architect John T. Lyle, who coined the term and created some of the early principles for regenerative design, inspired by Robert Roddale's regenerative agriculture. But really, as it is understood today, regenerative design comes from a school of environmental and design scholars, including Lyle and people like David Orr, Sim van der Rin, Fritjof Capra, and many others who were concerned with what we call systems thinking. An Adidas sneaker doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has a wide-ranging impact on its production, its sale, its use, and once it is worn out, passing through many different environments and coming into contact with many different beings, both human and non-human. By virtue of the complexity of systems and systems thinking, regenerative design is understood as necessarily interdisciplinary in its practice, and it thrives in co-creation environments where the design is shaped by community and ecosystems for which it is created. Which means that the product of regenerative design can range dramatically in its scope and subject matter. For example, we can look at these recent design focused on insects that takes the form of insect feeding and housing constructions in contexts where insects are threatened. These simple constructions can be helped to restore healthy populations that support ecosystem health. These can seem like rather simple concepts, but when we consider the shocking decline of insect species as it has been seen across Europe, such simple considerations for how design influences the broader ecosystem begin to appear as urgent imperatives. While these more subtle entries into regenerative design show a lot of promise, especially as they are designed for specific contexts and systems, both social and ecological, the desire to apply simplified solutions to massive systems quickly becomes more problem than solution. In New York City, the implementation of an interface that monitors tree health and eco-labor has effectively commodified regenerative tree growth in the urban context of New York. By assigning currency to trees and their ecological benefits, the interface has given property owners the tools to drive up rent prices and around healthy green areas and cause what's called green gentrification. It has made trees into an exchangeable carbon currency to offset new environmentally dubious developments and investments from the city, and has justified the removal of poorly performing trees for younger trees that will be just as quickly dispensed with as soon as they no longer become good carbon assets. Even as designers have been demonstrating examples of how regenerative design can be used to subvert the wasteful and exploitative systems of industrial production, the application of regenerative design strategies are being used as a vehicle for greenwashing. This case reveals how top-down design for regeneration, especially at a large scale like this one, can quickly be exploited and commodified, can commodify a system that many people and different species are dependent upon. Still, designers are showing more and more examples of how regenerative design can be used to build new economic systems from the ground up, and are openly critical of systems that are exploiting both sustainable and regenerative design processes. In the province of Trentino, Italy, the design collective known as Brave New Alps has developed a community-built sparkling beverage company called Comunità Frizzante that uses interdisciplinary co-creation to establish regenerative social and ecological systems. By design, the whole community is invited to have a hand in the process of developing these drinks. People are invited to join in sessions to come up with ideas for flavoring, to go on guided walks around the local landscape and harvest blends. Local farmers in the region help to source ingredients. The local science museum helps in identifying promising local flora. Experts and chefs are invited to help run the workshops to create the mixtures. Other organizations provide space for bottling and manufacturing, while local bars and restaurants distribute the products as an alternative to major industrial soda drink brands like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Comunità Frizzante here uses regenerative design principles to create a system of production and distribution that ties together a healthy local ecosystem and strong social framework within that specific environment. Through projects like Comunità Frizzante, we can start to rethink what the role of the design is and where it should be applied, and who is serving in these precarious times. Much of the contemporary movement for sustainable design has been shaped by Western modernity, which has often perpetuated the belief that good design and innovation can itself mitigate the growing crises of our society and planet. What we find among designers working for solutions to the climate and ecological crises is that the most compelling visions of the future of ecology and society comes from those designers that are turning a critical eye towards capitalism and the very systems that have shaped contemporary design practice, making it increasingly clear that in this time of mass extinction, what it means to design must be radically reshaped. What distinguishes regenerative design from many approaches to sustainability and ecology in design is a redefining of the role of the designer. Rather than using objects and communication to dictate how people should live and interact with the world around them, the regenerative designer uses design as a tool to help others, both people and other species, design for themselves and create new healthy systems for being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful presentation. I really like the phrase beautifully designed waste. That's a really powerful way of thinking about it. Thank you for that. So next up for our second segment, we have David Reeve and Luciane Pisani, who are the editor and art director of Where the Leaves Fall, and they will be opening our second segment.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, John and Afsane. It was really great and really insightful, the presentation. So we are the editors of Where the Leaves Fall. It's a magazine exploring humankind's connection with nature. We print quarterly, and we do the magazine in conversation with Omved Gardens in Highgate in London.
So for the next issue of the magazine, one of the themes we were exploring was equity. And the writer Tim Leeson came to us with the suggestion of a Q&A with the brilliant Zayan Khan, who is a cultural practitioner and a food activist and artist, and her particular focus on indigenous food reclamation. So I'm going to hand you over, before I fumble any more words, to Tim and Zayan, if you'd like to join us.
Thank you very much, Dave and Luciane. Yeah, it's great to be involved with Where the Leaves Fall, and it's an honor to be chatting with Zayan this evening. If she's, Hi. Are you still there? Yeah. Cool.
I'm here.
So in our interview for the upcoming edition, we touched on the waves of immigration that have occurred in Southern Africa, and how some of the very first people in the region, the Khoi and the San, are still very marginalized. And while we can't travel a lot at the moment, a friend recently got up to the Kalahari and was chatting to someone that works with the San people, and there was a line that they used to describe them, which was, they speak in stories. And that really stuck with me. And when I raised it with you, you mentioned that that's how I work. And I was wondering if you could go from there, sort of explain how you work and expand on that sentiment.
Yeah, for sure. This idea of speaking in stories, we hear this around the world, right? This is how a lot of First Nations and Indigenous peoples are and identify, and this is what, you know, keeps our cosmologies alive. But for someone like me, for someone like me who I kind of describe myself as kind of in the in-betweens, I have to create my own cosmologies, or I have to create new cosmologies, because the ones that we inherited were taken from us and were silenced or stolen and shamed. And so a lot of those stories, they don't exist anymore and they're extinct. And a lot of them are very much about our inherent survivorship. So the stories of our births, the stories of, you know, the medicines that we know and the foods and the recipes, and the stories of our people, they don't exist anymore because of colonization, because of, you know, mass genocide and all the things that we know of the world. But the fact is also that we come from oral tradition, and so the stories are so important. And so even though all these stories have kind of vanished, my people are still storytellers. You know, we still, you know, it's what drives us. And And so it took me a long while to figure out that that's actually, that is what I do. And it's really looking at the stories of land and sea, obviously, but, the land is under the sea. So stories of land and food and seed specifically that allow us to kind of find our stories and to create these cosmologies again. And so if it needs to be through a social political lens or through, telling stories about these kind of hardships to children or people who aren't thinking about these kinds of things, you need a certain artistry to be able to do that. And so that's somehow been my vocation for the last decade and a bit.
Amazing. And one of the projects of yours that really stands out for me, especially at the moment, and I'll apologize because my Afrikaans is still very average, but the Seed Bibliotheek, I've been reading,
Well done.
thank you. I've been reading lots of Baba Bibliotheek books to my little son. So I was just wondering if you could share the genesis of that project and how it's evolved in the years since it first launched.
Yeah, I can't even remember when. I think it was 2015. But the Seed Bibliotheek, for those of you who, it's seed library, right? It means seed library. There were friends who had been occupying a piece of land. The land is still occupied at the moment. It's a prime real estate in the city. It's on the mountain and it's being farmed and it's been farmed, etc. And they were always at risk of removal. And so when the risk was kind of at the greatest, at one moment we all came together and just had a massive market. Like so many people came. It was the fullest it had ever been. And our offering for that occupation and for that market was a seed library. And we did it so last minute. And we literally just used Facebook. And we said, look, we're going to be doing this. We're supporting the occupation. We've got seeds. Our friends have seeds. If you have seeds, whoever you are, come, bring your seeds, come share stories, come share, come exchange. And it was so wonderful because people came from all over the district. They came from outside the district. They brought seeds. People brought seeds that were like 20 years old, of which, out of 40 seeds, I got one to germinate. Like ridiculous things, like seeds that people, so, and seed packages that people had beautifully drawn out with a name and like the fruits. And it was just so exquisite that there was such a connection that people had with seeds, people we didn't even know in our community. And our community was quite big. And so it was a really wonderful thing to see how seed just brings people together. And what was so particular about it was that it wasn't particularly farmers or gardeners. And so it became a very obvious thing that there was a need for a seed library that told stories, and a seed library that obviously had seed, but also could talk to the other elements of seed that weren't about growing food or flowers, right? Seed for instruments, and seed for making natural dyes, and seed for making jewelry, and teethers for babies, all that kind of thing. And it subsequently, I started doing these pop-ups around the way with seed games and all that kind of stuff. And it's now the basis of my PhD, which is around how seed is objectified through global seed laws and patent laws and treaties, and how Africa is completely objectified in that process, and how we relate to seed. And so working through this idea of the commons into a space where seed is or reviving or reclaiming that story of seed.
And you mentioned that a lot of the time it was women that were largely responsible for cultivation and management of plants, and again have been marginalized and pushed to the side. I guess could you explain a bit more of the dynamic of how like seed patents and that aspect affects the peasant farmer or the more basic farmer?
Yeah, I mean, anybody. That's kind of how, because the word I'm looking for is the argument, or the majority of how the story is seen is that you have corporations and government, right? You can imagine government is sitting in the front pocket of corporations who own the seed, who own the patent for the seed, and against the farmers, right? So the farmers all kind of squashed under the weight of these, and you've seen it around the world with green revolution and stuff like this. But basically what it means is that seed that has been cultivated and bred over millennia by many farmers, majority women farmers. Every farmer is standing on the shoulders of giants, right? What corporations have done and breeders have done is to select particular seeds from farmers and then breed it to have a certain, to go according to what their kind of very industrial model of seed needs to be. So, and what we've seen also over the years, I mean, I've been doing this work for over a decade, and the majority of the seed, for example, the genetically modified seed, they're not doing what they're being sold as, you know. So the drought tolerant varieties of maize are not drought tolerant compared to traditional varieties from farmers. And so where my interest comes in is to say, okay, we've got this almost binary opposition, but what about the rest of us? Because that binary, the sense is that, you know, governments are like, you know, that story is getting old. We know a lot of wealthy farmers. I don't know what you're talking about. And, you know, the fight and the battle on the ground with farmers on farms and traditional seed, you know, libraries just being taken by extension service. It's really horrific, the stories. And so trying to say, well, there are so many other people who use seed, and there are so many other uses of seed. Let's amplify the voices of the farmers with all of these other stories, you know?
Yeah.
It's so much work.
For sure. I guess I probably should have mentioned at the start. I mean, we're both based in South Africa. You're in Cape Town. I'm in Quebec. And unfortunately, South Africa has been in the media quite a bit lately. There's been unrest in the north of the country, in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. As we're sort of both in the south, I guess we're not really in a position to talk a lot of the specifics that is happening up there, but I guess it does highlight, again, the high level of inequality in South Africa. And there's tied to this is like the disconnection from lands and land ownership. And in South Africa at the moment, there's a big conversation on land expropriation without compensation. And it's one of the ideas pushing the concept is that it's a way to, you know, address past issues, past the colonization of the land. And then I guess the counter to that argument is some people debating the issues around food scarcity. Are we going to be able to produce enough food, especially in a changing climate? And I was just wondering if you could sort of speak to this a little bit on industrial farming maybe, and how you see this debate playing out in South Africa.
Love these kind of questions. I'm not afraid to say that land expropriation without compensation is honestly like the best option we have, and it's the most political. But what else is the option? Because so many of these farms, the majority of the large-scale farms, and you see it, like if you've ever come to South Africa and just gone to any wine farm, you will see it. Like colonialism, it still exists. Yeah. And there's this heavy kind of pride about it also, which is so shocking, because so many people, the majority of the people, and the indigenous peoples, have, you know, been really marginalized by by agriculture and by the settlements of these white Europeans. And so although land expropriation without compensation is so complex, and it's, you know, it's still kind of sitting within this very capitalistic notion, there's a sense that there's like a shift that there allows for this shift. But we know that also the complexities are so huge that to even begin to kind of unpack it or try to work through it and what happens after the land has been, compensated, etc. Our relationship with land, we've also, let me put it this way. So our system of government and the way that we, engage in our day-to-day, we've been so ingrained, and capitalism is so much a part of our culture that it's almost as if we don't know how to function without it. And so our relationship with land, you can see that very easily, because an indigenous way of land, here specific in the Cape, is that land, there was a sense of ownership, but the land was open to all. So Tim comes to visit and Tim wants to harvest some bulbs and maybe, allow for the sheep to graze, your sheep to graze here or whatever, then you would just give me something in exchange for that. But the land remained mine, but it was open to all. Whereas now we know that that's completely not the case anymore. But what I really love is this like the rhetoric that's been so, what's the word, like co-opted by corporations, is that when they talk about, but then our food security is going to be, it's going to be really challenging because, a majority of these farms are actually producing the food we eat. It's not true. The amount of, first of all, the amount of export that these farms are producing for, but also the model of farming that we have is so extractive. The agriculture is so extractive. It uses so much water. It relies so heavily on chemical inputs. It's such a closed economic system. It relies on slave wage. The farm workers are, modern day slavery. None of this is a secret. This is all just kind of the majority of people just don't know about that kind of stuff. But it's out there. And the biggest kind of thing of all is that they claim they've co-opted this word food security, because if you look at it truthfully, at least a third of it goes to waste. There's so much of it gets dumped. And because it works under a kind of like a free market system, the farmers set the price also. And so while the government does have like regulations and so on, it's, farmers honestly do get to say how much they want. And a lot of times when they can't get the price that they want, then the food gets dumped. So we have to understand it from that perspective, that we have far too much food in the world. The other perspective on that is that the food that they're growing is not food that's like really good for us. I did an art piece about this, talking about how our food is white. Our food has been so taken down to just being food that fills the proletariat's, bellies. It's not food that's nutritious. It's not food that's particularly delicious either,
Yeah, and
so
largely,
I mean, we just, precisely. Yeah. It's not. It's. So that's. I mean, this could be a whole interview by itself. The question.
For sure. I guess one last one just to touch on before we go is in Cape Town, you're dealing with flooding at the moment and this winter, but previously day zero and this highlighting climate change and water scarcity in Cape Town was a big issue. And I was just wondering, do you think that it is there now a better appreciation in the city community about natural resources and the natural systems? Do you think there has been a shift there?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there has. And you also see a lot more like middle class people storing water, which wasn't usual before. So you'll find most properties will have tanks and so on, and everybody still has a bucket in their shower, and like people hardly take baths and stuff like that. But something that needs to be said is that naturally in wintertime, we have permanent wetland and then we have seasonal wetland. And during apartheid, during apartheid, a lot of, when people were forcibly removed out of white area zoned places, they were put onto areas that in winter become wetlands. So if you were to dig a little deeper in the summertime, you would have found a whole lot of plants that, sprout in the winter, etc., because of the water load. And so it's just, it's been completely by design that happens, and nothing has changed. We're 20-something years after democracy, but it's something that people we don't get to talk about that much. That the flooding has been here way long before we have, and the architecture of the city hasn't kind of done anything to compensate those that were forced to live there.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. I'm very grateful to see that the electricity has stayed on for both of us.
Totally.
And
thank you so much, Tim.
It's wonderful to have a chat with you again.
Thank you guys both so much, and especially to Zayon for weathering the load shedding like a trooper. I'm so glad that it held up all that time. That was such a fascinating and in-depth conversation. So thank you both. So finally, for our third segment, we now have Martha Dillon, the editor of It's Freezing in LA, who will introduce the next segment for us.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks so much, Diane and Tim, for a really, really fascinating conversation. So my name is Martha Dillon. I run It's Freezing in LA magazine, which prints critical essays and slow journalism about climate change. Our focus is on shaping and challenging environmental thinking and ideas within the green movement, so campaigning with progressive environmental activist groups and artistic collectives as well. Our 7th issue came out a couple of months ago on the topic of regeneration, so we were really excited to work with Icarus Complex and Where the Leaves Fall to keep exploring those ideas tonight. And we have invited Michael Smythe to explore the topic of regeneration for our segment. Michael is an artist, an urban farmer, and creative director of Nomad Project, an independent arts foundation that develops experimental projects across digital and location-specific spaces. And today he'll be introducing his current work at the Phytology Project, an urban physics garden and research institute in London. Through this work, he looks at regenerative ecologies and tactile resistance in the Anthropocene, as well as strategies for individuals and communities to reshape urban, environmental and social equity. So over to you, Michael.
Yeah, that's quite a mouthful. Thanks for everyone here tonight, and thanks for the invitation to present. I'm just going to put on a presentation. So basically, my starting point is the fact that I've lived in very densely urban environments for now the majority of my life. And I think in that time, there's been a lot of sort of disconnect in myself personally, but also the realization within the communities that I've lived around, a disconnect between the landscape and the urban environment, almost like they're separate things. A disconnect between the body and the landscape as well. And I guess as an artist, I was very curious in that sort of challenge, that kind of, I guess, modern dilemma, because cities are relatively new sort of situations for the human species, for our species. So with a collaborator, Nassim Khan, who was a journalist and activist, we decided to look around our neighborhood in Bethnal Green, East London, and engage with some of the issues around densification in particular and gentrification. We became aware that there was a small pocket nature reserve not too far from where we both lived, and it had been recently designated as a development opportunity, basically making it a car park and flats on what is now a quarter of an acre. So we reached out to the local residents, which we'd known for quite a while. One woman in particular called Margaret Cox, who's a bit of a local legend, and inquired about the land, and they were beside themselves with not really knowing how to kind of protect it from the development of the council. So we got together and created the Phytology Project. Phytology essentially means the study of plants and botany. Phytology started off as a action within the nature reserve, activate usage, to open the gates. It's a fenced site, it's a quarter of an acre in one of the most densely populated parts of London. It's sort of nestled between the financial district of Liverpool Street and Canary Wharf, some of the most expensive areas in the Northern Hemisphere. And in between is a huge amount of social sort of pressures in terms of densification, unemployment, pollution, so on and so forth, rising property prices, has some of the most expensive properties in all of London, but some of the lowest earning people in the UK. So we decided to open the gates and sort of situate a medicine garden in the middle of the site to basically push back on the council's objective of development through getting the space back into the bloodstream of the people locally, but also people across London, to kind of identify what was there and to celebrate kind of almost the unseen, the in-betweens, the medicine plants, the trees, the shrubs, the biodiversity that was existing within the site. The process of building the meadow was quite, funny, I guess. It was that process of kind of getting to know the land, getting to know how to work with it, working with plants that would normally grow there, and failing dismally in the first year to actually grow anything that was harvestable at all. But in that process, sort of unraveled something quite useful for our strategies anyway, of kind of involving people in the process of doing, of learning, of researching, of activating a piece of land. The following year, we managed to actually get things growing in the garden. And the sort of paradigm of the medicine garden is plants that were common to the streets of London for 1,000+ years with ongoing medicinal value. Things that would have been used for, centuries for, everything from respiratory health through to kind of building your immune strength. In this photograph alone, you've got, a huge collection of medicine plants from Ribot plantain to marshmallow to comfrey. And plants that are, in a sense, been forgotten in terms of their value and their kind of use. And also, for me, very much linked to the way people can sometimes forget cities are actually remarkable habitats that we could shape and kind of make in terms of, I guess, bottom-up development as opposed to top-down. Celebrating the in-between, I guess this is all about. We run the medicine garden primarily as a habitat, but also as an education space and a farm. So we harvest quite a lot of medicine there on a weekly basis, particularly through spring and summer. And we also teach people how to engage with plants through identification, foraging in terms of how to select plants and not sort of damage them in the process. And most importantly, how to then incorporate that into your diet and your sort of day-to-day medicine consumption. The other part of phytology is the idea of culture in the broader sense of the terms, in terms of human culture, but also, more than human culture. And I guess I call them entry points. The idea that complexity is important to kind of hold and encourage. And a piece of land such as ours is an incredibly complex land. So it's celebrating those nuances through various different languages, vocabularies, aesthetics. This is a photograph of the Bulgarian choir singing one time a few summers ago when we were still able to gather, and an image of our billboard. There is an intervention within the woods, which is currently hosting artwork by the brilliant Adelaide Bannerman and Days Ataji, who's a climate activist, and Adelaide is a curator in London who lives locally, who's developing the cultural program for the coming year, which is very exciting and worth checking out. The billboard interrupts the space per se and kind of talks to the city. It changes quarterly, and it's just another entry point for us to have a dialogue with the city around us. So part of the work, I guess, is occupation and protection of land from development, but it's also about embedding sort of the wider landscape into people's minds and their hearts. One of the projects we did back in 2015-16 was a pipistrelle bat protection project. Pipistrelle bats are relatively common species in cities in the UK. They are endangered. They're very tiny. They're around the size of your thumb. They're an indicator of sort of a healthy environment. You know, they are the first species, like frogs, to go when the environment is under stress. With development, a lot of the new housing doesn't actually accommodate these remarkable creatures. So we decided to kind of enhance the habitat opportunities for the pipistrelle bat within our small nature reserve, but also use it as a bit of a touchstone, I guess, for conversations around social housing and the benefits of wild community spaces that could actually host a huge amount of biodiversity, which benefits, obviously, everyone if they know what they're looking at and how to protect it. So this is a series of sort of boxes with different crevices inside. It's technically a maternity roost. Pipistrelle bats co-parent when they're raising their young. And these boxes can house 50 plus bats. It's also one of our sort of tools, I guess, for communicating to the landowners that this is a site worth protecting. We're not naive to think it is, that alone will stop the development of the piece of land, but through actually making a mosaic of different kind of interventions across the site, from the medicine garden through to the bat project and our wetland scheme, it's this mosaic in a sense that adds complexity and makes it harder to kind of sort of justify the removal of these places. But in doing so, also sort of encourages a deeper connection to land and sort of urban sort of stewardship in a way, encouraging people to connect. So this is an image of our ecologist, Ollie Edmonds, leading one of the many bat walks we hosted that year. The following year, we stretched out to 7 different estates that had similar, slightly different issues to us in terms of densification pressures. And we built habitats with the residents. And we also kind of shared our language around sort of occupation, protection of land through ecological restoration. This is a project by the British artist Fiona Bennett, which took place last year. For 2020, which was quite a complicated year to be doing research, but equally a great year to be embedded within a nature reserve, looking at the environment and looking at language in particular. Fiona, her work is based around language. She started to research marine protection zones around the UK, particularly around the Brexit period where, you know, fisheries were kind of a big kind of talking point. She realized that in the North Sea, in Dogger Bank to be specific, there was a marine protection zone that was still being illegally fished by dragnet fishers. And she called the government to account on this, to make a stand, in which they chose not to. So then, with the help of Greenpeace, Fiona set about carving some large granite full stops in different font types. The font to the left is Peanuts, which was dropped into the Dogger Bank along with a collection of other large granite full stops, and Clang, which is on the right-hand side, which was dumped in front of George Eustace's office at DEFRA. Sort of holding them account through physical action, through an intervention. The coordinates of DEFRA are on the base of Clang, which now rests at the Bethnal Green Nature Reserve as a touchstone once again for conversations around climate change and being accountable to language, how we use language and the protection of sort of, I guess, common land. So for us, I guess the most important thing is the sensory aspect, having the ability to physically engage with the landscape, really trying to embed the agency for local residents to kind of take an active role in working closely with the various features across the site, from the wetland redevelopment to the bat project to the medicine garden. Through actually touching and feeling and engaging with the landscape, you develop a connection to it that is essential, I think, in a time where we're heading into unknown territory in terms of climate change. And if people don't understand what particular things are, then they tend not to love them, then they tend not to want to advocate for their protection. So another toolkit I guess I use is sort of digital, the digital realm. A few years ago, I was kind of struck by how everyone's always asking me to qualify the impact of vitology in terms of pennies and pounds. And I just felt that was kind of the wrong paradigm to kind of measure such a project like this. So I developed, alongside my collaborators, Andrea McKelly from King's College London, and Joanna Gibbons and Neil Davidson from Jane L. Gibbons Landscape Design. We got together and designed an app, which was quite funny. We're not app designers, but we tried it anyhow. And Urban Mind essentially is an attempt to measure people's lived experience within the environment in which they move about in from day to day. It uses a very simple technology called ecological momentary assessment. Essentially, it's a questionnaire asked at randomized moments as you go about your day. It kind of measures, asks you to self-report how you feel and where you are, and kind of captures the kind of interactive features, such as whether you can hear birds or see trees. And kind of qualifies, I guess, the impact of these things, but also the social element. Do you feel safe? Do you feel like the people around you share the same values as you? We started up thinking it would just be a London-wide project, but soon it slipped globally, and now it's in about 7 different languages. And our first piece of writing came out a few years ago in Bioscience, where we were able to kind of finally prove something that is anecdotally an assumption we could make quite easily, that actually seeing trees and hearing birds, sorry, is good for our mental health. But oddly, that had never been measured before. And that's incredibly helpful data for us, particularly people using sort of strategies of ecological strategies for protecting and securing land for public use. So we were able to take it away from the conversations of what's the financial of this to actually, the more kind of psycho-emotional benefits of these spaces. In particular, the findings did qualify our hypotheses that, seeing trees and hearing birds did have a benefit on our mental health, but actually it went further to kind of qualify that the more prone you are to mental health stresses, which we all are, the greater benefit, and there is a dosage effect as well. And the useful thing there is also the advocacy of making sure the green spaces are maintained and protected. Here in the UK, a lot of parks are losing their funding, and it's not a given that a green space will be positive. If it's not kept well and cared for, it could actually have a negative effect. So Urban Mind, we hope, is a useful tool for advocating for these important features in a city. And finally, I guess I'm talking through a series of different strategies that, in a sense, pull on a lot of permaculture principles of earth care, people care, and fair share. And the fair share element is, I guess, linked to the Mobile Apothecary Project, which was formed in 2019 with Shamasa Khan and Rashika Ahmed, and since has grown into a large group of volunteers that continually get together and make medicine for distribution on the streets of London. It originally came about through working with herbalists without borders. Melissa Ronaldson, who's a great herbalist in London. She was going to Calais to hand out medicines and give support in the jungle at the time in France. And we got together and made a large vat of cough syrup, which we gave to Melissa to take away. Then we were sort of reflecting on this process and thought, actually, it's important that we also vision for our immediate community, especially 2019. Homelessness was definitely on the increase again as it's continued. So we set about teaching people how to identify, forage, and make medicine on a larger scale, and from herbs that are readily available from the phytology garden and wider around the city. The medicines we make are distributed on a fortnightly basis in Dalston, Hackney, and Bethnal Green. And we offer a pretty extensive range of a lot of respiratory health medicines, such as decongestant rubs and cough syrups, but a lot of kind of day-to-day support medicines that we can often take for granted. The most important thing there, though, is that connection back to the land and the connection to herbal medicine and the sort of history of herbal medicine as the medicine for the people, which is something that leads back to land stewardship and seeing cities as an abundant place where we should actually take an active role in shaping and advocating for bottom-up access. I see phytology as a futuristic project, not nostalgic or kind of quaint. It's very much a provision like hospitals and schools. We should have spaces, community activated spaces in all of our neighborhoods, not similar, each specific to the specific context, but it's very important that we push back a little bit and make cities that are reflective of our communities and supportive of a full biodiverse, healthy existence. And just finishing with a Babadillion quote that is quite meaningful to me in terms of conservation and the kind of endeavor we try to do in terms of stewardship and kind of care within the urban context. Anyway, thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a really wonderful and inspiring presentation. I also live in Bethnal Green and I didn't know about the nature reserve, so I'm definitely going to find out where it is and check it out. That was great. I think we've reached the point in the evening where we have time for just a few questions. We've got a couple both from some of our panelists and from members of the audience. Just to start with, before I jump into that, let me just take a look at who this one was for. Right, there's one from Rupert for John, I think. And the question there is, why is it so difficult to tie design principles back to funding conservation of the ecosystems that inspire biomimicry, etc.?
Yeah, I don't think it's, I actually don't think it's so difficult to tie design principles back to ecosystems and conservation of environments. But there's so much of design in education is really centered around very specific incidences of human interaction and being and use. And so little of it is about actually taking a holistic approach to the spaces and the people that you're designing for. It's much of design education, at least coming from the tradition of the US and Europe, is really centered around these ideas. What's popular now, or has been for a while, is the idea of human-centered design, which is not really about humans necessarily, but more about like the idea of the human as consumer and very specific incidences. But I think to answer the question, I think tying design principles back into ecology can be quite easy as long as designers are given exposure to not only the ecologies that need to be designed for and that design can help serve, but also other disciplines and other people that can help to create a healthier system of regenerative design.
Great, thank you so much, John. Where the Leaves Fall had a question for Zayan as well. In the second issue of the magazine, we ran a Q&A with Mashudu Takalani of Earth Law Foundation in South Africa. Mashudu is from the Venda culture in the Northeast and talks of seed diversity and how that diversity enables them to adapt to their environment and any changes in climate and growing conditions. Can we regenerate through seed? could you talk a little bit about this? I find this is a question I also wanted to ask. I'm really curious to hear what you say.
This is the kind of question that's like an hour response. But so I've just written something down very briefly. But I think this is a lot of why we're looking at the story of seed. And Earth Law Foundation is an excellent organization that really embeds itself in the culture of seed. And they talk a lot, they do a lot of work around these like cosmologies as well, and regeneration. So if you can place the seed centrally and are led by the seed, we allow those recipes, for example, whether they are for, recipes to store seed, or recipes for food, recipes for medicine, what recipes to unfold before us. And we make decisions according to the flavors, according to how they store, their storability or their storage, what our families like, what's available to us. We can recalibrate our needs to what we have where we are, instead of trying to chase the money or chase the bank, and put those needs before what's out there in front of us. And so recentering seed is a way that we can recenter ourselves.
Oh, I think we may have lost you, Zayan. Let me just wait for a little bit.
Through seeds.
Oh, there we go.
And regenerating through seeds from that perspective. If you look at the way that we, like, kind of our humanity has kind of this ownership of seed. We've got these seed libraries and community seed libraries and home seed libraries, and then we've got seed banks. And everything has its place, of course, in the way that the world is these days. But you can really already, with the language, you can see the difference between the library and the bank, where the library is really a community center. It's a place that you can seek help. You can seek from administrative help to knowledge seeking. You can make photocopies. You can meet people and have a meeting there. There's all these things that we do at the library. A very specific place that has, it's not really about that reciprocity, in as much as they want you to believe that it is, but there is the sense of things going into a bank and kind of being kept in these cold, storage cellars and, whatever the case is. And that's the same with the seed. The seed goes into the bank and it gets desiccated to a point where there's very little water left, and it gets frozen so that it can be kept for however long. And we see this with the Svalbard, the Global Seed Vault, it's called, in Norway, especially, which is kind of like the ultimate of our seed storage of the world, that's going to kind of save us when the Armageddon comes, right? When the apocalypse hits. But when you lock something out of its continual engagement with the environment, then you neglect to have that continual evolution. And so these seeds and the plants and the people are not able to adapt within these changing climates. They're not able to adapt to the subtle changes and the big changes, the changes in people's, flavor preferences, all the rest of it. And so there's a lot to be said about, there's a necessity for the banks in some cases, but the libraries really are where we are seeing, and we have seen for millennia, right? Climate resilience, and the resilience of people through seed, and then of course of seed itself. I hope I answered that. That was very wafty.
That was really, really interesting. I've sort of never thought about that disconnect, the difference between a library and a bank, sort of in terms of the way we describe things. That's really powerful, really interesting. And as you say, we could have a whole session just on that subject alone. I have just one final question, if everyone's all right with me asking this one. I think it was also from Rupert for Michael this time. Do you know how many naturally occurring vascular plants occur in your reserve? And I wondered if I could just tack on to that something I was interested in about as well, which is what knowledge sources you relied on to tell you which plants had been around in the vicinity for thousands of years, as you said, and which ones were medicinal. Where did you actually find that information in order to help you make those decisions about what to include?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. They're great questions. In terms of the vascular element, the whole site is basically full of medicine trees, shrubs, and plants. But in particular, the plants that I personally use for my own vascular health is a tree called hawthorn, which is readily available in most of the UK, if not Northern Europe, and also a plant called yarrow, achillea, which is also very common globally, but particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. Both of them stimulate good blood flow and heart health. Hawthorn kind of strengthens the heart muscle. It kind of builds, I guess it kind of soothes and calms, so the heart pumps stronger, pumping more blood around the body. And it also slows down the heart rate slightly, like I guess a statin would. In terms of the kind of whole paradigm of what to include within the medicine garden, we spoke to a range of different, I guess, people that come from very different philosophies, from ethnobotanists through to herbalists and horticulturalists, and kind of pooled that information and knowledge to kind of build a profile of, I guess, 30 plants that we initially started with. We had the fortune of working with a ethnobotanist called Peter Giovannini from Kew, who did the initial seed list and peer review to make sure that things were accurate in terms of biomedical application. But since, we've worked a lot with remarkable herbalists such as Melissa Ronaldson and Rashika Ahmed, which I mentioned before, and knowledgeable horticulturalists like Shamasa Khan, to kind of build our kind of knowledge bank and then share different ways of communicating. The sort of, I guess, the providence of 1,000 years was kind of a sort of a rough line in the sand to suggest that everything migrates. There's no necessarily such thing as indigenous, but plants, people, other mammals all move about. And particularly with climate change, we're noticing that there is a big shift in what is becoming more successful, such as Mediterranean plants. So we're growing a lot more of those specific medicine plants in our garden to build sort of resilience with the current dry, hot summers that we're experiencing. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, that was very interesting. It was really interesting hearing where all the information came from. There was just one very quick addendum to the question from Rupert, which is he meant vascular plants, meaning non-fungi and lichens. Do you have a response to that?
Vascular plants is non-fungi and lichen, as in, do we grow fungi and lichen?
I think the question is, do you know how many naturally occurring vascular plants occur in the reserve? So vascular plants meaning non-fungi, non-lichens.
Wow, that's a good question. We've done an audit a couple of years ago, which I think there were like 28 varieties of trees, probably 50 varieties of hedge, and over 100+ varieties of sort of meadow style planting. But that said, it's always changing, particularly in the last 3 years with hotter, drier summers. Like some summers it hasn't rained at all. And it's interesting, when you tend land, you become very aware of that. So it's always shifting. So I couldn't give you a definitive answer to that. I just recommend you come to the reserve and we can go for a walk and identify things.
Yeah, you could get a community effort involved. Everyone can do a little logbook of all the plants in there. Thank you, Michael, for tackling that question. I think that those were all the questions that we had, and we are 10 minutes over. I know that it's late. It's sort of dinner time for people in the UK. So just to say thank you, everyone, for your incredibly insightful contributions. Thank you so much to our speakers and our panelists and the guests we invited on, and everyone who was here this evening, and also to our audience for attending and for contributing your very thoughtful questions. It's been a really, really interesting series of conversations. Just to quickly note before we close that our third Restarting the Future event will be on August the 14th, and it will be live and in person. What a crazy idea. And it will be at the Omvet Gardens in London with Where the Leaves Fall, Emergence magazine, and Icarus Complex magazine. So please check any of the magazine's social pages for ticket information and further details. But for now, unless anyone had anything else to add, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It was really great to chat to you all and to see you all. And have a good evening. Thank you.